Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 3, talk about species diversity. So today we're going to talk about what is a species. When we say the word species, how do we define that as biologists? What does that mean? It can be different for different groups of organisms. We'll see that. How many species are there on planet Earth as a whole? Why should we care? What's the value of having all these different species? So for starters, what's a species? Well, for you, think about it to yourself. If somebody says the word species, what does that mean to you? How do you define species? You're walking around in the woods, you see different things. How do you know they're different species? Okay. So most biologists use what's called the morphological species concept. This is kind of what started out. It's been around for a while. It says that a species is a group of individuals that is morphologically, physiologically, or biochemically distinct from other groups in some important characteristic. So that's in use a lot. And another thing that a lot of biologists use is what's called the biological definition of a species. And that's a group of individuals that can potentially breed among themselves that do not breed with individuals of other groups. Now, this works great for sexually reproductive species, but the evolutionary concept, let's say we're talking about bacteria. Bacteria don't have sex. So how do we know if they can interbreed or not? And so there, the evolutionary species concept works a little bit better. But they're both in use, and just kind of depends on which group of organisms you're talking about, which one you're going to use. So even within, the biological species concept, saying that species that interbreed are the same thing, we have some problems. So if we look at brown bears, we got these guys here, the big grizzly bear or whatever. Brown bears are found in North America and Eurasia. But we consider them the same species. Now, obviously, a bear hanging out in Montana or in Canada is not going to be able to breed with a bear living in Russia or Finland. But we still consider them the same species because likelihood is if they were to be reintroduced to one another, they could interbreed still. We have this other bear here in North America, the black bear. Their ranges overlap quite a bit, especially up in the north, but however, they do not mate with one another, so they're definitely different species. Within domesticated species, people have done what we call artificial selection through many generations to create traits that we find desirable within different varieties of plants or breeds of animals. So if we take, for example, dogs, we consider all dogs to be the same species. That being said, within the biological species concept, they fit, because if you could somehow fit a Chihuahua and a Great Dane together, they would make offspring that could reproduce. However, they look really, really different. So they fit the biological species concept, but not the morphological, because they look so different. Part of the morphological species concept is that you can look at stuff. That's what morphology means, is how you look, and tell if they're the same or not. Do they look different? Dogs definitely, you can think about all the different dog breeds there are out there. They definitely look different, but however, they can still interbreed, so they're considered in the same species. Another example that can be trickier are some toads. So in eastern Kentucky, we have the American toad and the Fowler's toad. Now, these two toads look very, very similar. There are some differences morphologically, the number of warts on their glands and stuff, but to the untrained eye, they look super similar. They're both brown, they're both bumpy, they look very similar. And so With these, they're what we call sibling species. And so they look the same, but they don't interbreed with one another. So they're not the same species by the biological species concept because they do not mate with one another. They breed at different times a year, but they follow the morphological because they look the same. So if you're just using it, you'd be like, oh, they look the same. They're the same thing. But the fact that they don't interbreed makes them different species. Sometimes, both in nature and due to people, we can have hybrids. And so, or sibling species. So if we look at the Mexican wolves, Canis rufus, and we look at Alaskan huskies, Canis familiaris, they're dogs, right? Like Alaskan husky, same species as a Chihuahua or a Great Dane, but they look an awful lot alike. And so we can take them and we can breed them together, and people do this, and we can make a wolf dog. It's a hybrid. People keep these things for pets sometimes, so they can't reproduce them because the hybrids are sterile. Yeah, but people create them, and in nature, there are examples of coyotes and dogs. They call them coy dogs when they interbreed and make hybrids. And so this happens. We got some salamanders that you can find in the streams around here. We got the southern two-line and the northern two-line, and these only differ genetically. So they look the same, they live in the same kind of places, but genetically they're distinct enough to be two different species, but they recently share a common ancestor, so we call them sibling species. So when you're thinking about groups of organisms and all the biodiversity and life on Earth out there, what do you think has the most species? Are there more trees? Are there more fish? Are there more mammals? What do you think to yourself there that's got the most? And species estimates range from total species counts. And if you think that there's more plants than fish or more fish than plants, we're going to see that here in just a moment. But real quick, the estimates range because there's a lot of stuff we haven't found yet, and we're sure we haven't found it. But estimates range from about 3.5 million up to over 100 million species. Most biologists kind of agree upon around a 10 to 15 million mark, so about 13.6. A lot of people believe that. But let's look at this. So we got bacteria, we got plants, we got fungi, we got protists, we got mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians. And so how many do we think there are of each? Well, we're not totally sure because there's a lot of stuff we haven't found yet. But how many have we found of each? We've only named about 6,200 species of bacteria, about 270,000 plants, 72,000 fungi, 80,000 species of protists. This includes algae. Over 1 million kinds of bugs. So arthropods are going to be mites, ticks, insects, things like this. Of that over 1 million, about 800,000 are insects. 400,000 of that 800,000 are beetles. Beetles rule the world. They're nature's favorite organism. There's more different kinds of beetles than any other animal by like a long shot. So there's a lot of different kinds of beetles. Mammals, cute furry stuff, there's only 5,000 of them. Fish, 20,000. Birds, about 10,000. Reptiles, about 10,000. And amphibians, about 7,000. Right, so if we're looking at that, you're like, well, there's a lot more insects than anything else. So if we look at the pie chart of life here, we got more insects than all the other stuff combined. Over half is insects. That being said, there's a lot of stuff we haven't found. We're just now developing the technologies to be able to identify and look at. And so this is our estimate of the green represents species that exist that are undescribed. Blue represents species that we have found and described. So if we look at how many we think there are out there, so viruses, species concepts and viruses are weird, but we have very few named species. There's lots. We're all the time discovering new kinds of viruses, so we think there's a ton of them, about 500,000 that we haven't found yet. Bacteria, there's at least 1 million species, maybe more, that we haven't described, because they're super complex. We have very few described species, mostly because within bacteria, we only describe the species that we can culture in a lab, and that's like not very many of them. It's estimated that if you take a handful of dirt, handful of soil, you'll have over 10,000 species of bacteria in it. And then if you travel 10 miles away and take a handful of soil, you'll have 10,000 other species of bacteria in it. But we can't grow any of those. We use environmental DNA samples to pull that out. But there's a lot of argument and discussion about what's a species of bacteria, how do we identify them and stuff, and we can grow very, very few of them. Nematodes are kinds of worms. Lots of species of those we haven't found yet. Crustaceans, we found quite a few, but there's a lot more out there, mostly in the oceans. Lots of little shrimp and stuff. Protists, these are like amoebas and slime molds and algae. We think there's a lot more of them, but we found this many. And well, I guess algae here, we're breaking out from regular protists, but like think seaweed, like kelp, and like the green scummy stuff on your pond. These are kinds of algae. Vertebrates, notice there's not very much green. Vertebrates are birds, anything with a backbone. Reptiles, fish, mammals. They're animals. We pretty much got all those. I mean, these things are animals too, but we don't typically like them as much, and we'll talk about that more later in the presentation. But with invertebrates, we've pretty much found them all. Mollusks, these are like clams and stuff, but it also includes stuff like squids and jellyfish. And like the giant squid, these things are longer than a school bus, and we've only ever found like 20 of them or something. So they're huge. They live in the ocean. We don't really know anything about them. Fungi, there's a tremendous number of undescribed fungi out there. And part of this is because fungi have a very complex life cycle that we're kind of just now in the last 20 years getting a handle on, and they're really complicated. Spiders, there's lots of spiders around the world. They're little. Haven't figured out all of them yet. Plants, we figured out most of the plants we think. I think that, you go to rainforests, go up in the mountains of South America, you're probably going to find some new species, but not a whole lot. And part of that, is plants don't move. They're easy to catch. Insects, we've described a tremendous number of insects. Remember, about 1 million species, 800,000 or whatever. But we estimate there's 5 to 10 million, way more. I have a friend who is an insect biologist. They call those people entomologists, but he's an entomologist, and he studies beetles. He studies a particular kind of beetle. It's a small family of beetles. And in his office, in his desk, he has over 50 species that are new to science, that are undescribed species, new to science, and he just hasn't had time to write the appropriate stuff to describe them. So, there's a tremendous number of insects that are undescribed now. And so why are some of these better documented than others? Well, some are bigger, like animals. We care more about them. Plants don't move. They're easier to catch. They don't have as complex a life cycle and that sort of thing. We kind of talked about that as we went through it. So if we look at soil nematodes, we look at these things called caecilians. They're kind of worms. And we look at mites and other things. So these are tiny. Like we have different species of eyebrow mites that live on humans. And if you live in different geographic regions of the world, you probably have different species. Fungi, super complicated. Many single-celled species out there, different kinds of yeasts. There's lots of asexual molds and stuff. They're complicated. Bacteria, like what the heck's a species in bacteria? They can just swap DNA with one another. It'd be like a polar bear and a pine tree being like, hey, let's change DNA. And they do. They're crazy. So what's going on there? But so we've established that there's a whole lot of species out there, and whether we found them all or not, there's a lot of factors on why we haven't. Um, One being just funding. There's less and less funding for scientists to study that kind of science and describe new species. Um, but how do we value those species? We've got all these different ones around the world. How do we value those different ones? Well, they can have different values. And so here's kind of the range of value stuff can have. And we're going to go through each of them individually, but we can have intrinsic value, economic value, spiritual value, scientific and educational, ecological, strategic, and then realized or potential values. So for something to have intrinsic value, it means that the species has a right to exist on its own, independent of its usefulness to people. It's just some dumb beetle, it needs to exist. Most conservation biologists believe that species have a right to exist, that they have intrinsic value, and this is what drives a lot of us to care. And so the World Conservation Union, which was formerly the IUCN, uses this thing called the red list status to determine exactly how endangered a species is. Is it about to go extinct? Is it already extinct? Is it totally fine and we can eat them? Like how much should we be concerned about it? And they have this scale. So least concerned, this is like salmon that we're going to eat, or white-tailed deer we're going to go shoot or something. There's no concern here. And it goes up, 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 all the way to extinct. And this is it's done, it's over. The species is gone from the planet Earth forever, which unfortunately happens quite frequently due to human actions. But so we go up. So we have near threatened, we have vulnerable, then we have endangered, we have critically endangered. And this means they're, one bulldozer could wipe them all out. Extinct in the wild does exactly what that says, that they're extinct in the wild. Maybe there's some alive in zoos, maybe there's some alive in botanic gardens, but otherwise they're extinct in the wild. And then totally extinct is gone forever. So if we look at giraffes and elephants, there's about 150,000 giraffes in Africa, and there's over 500,000 African elephants. And so which animal is more endangered? I'd like for you to look up their IUCN status for each. If you just go to Google and you type in IUCN red list, it'll pull it up, and you can do a species search. You can do giraffe, you can do African elephant, and look. So there's a lot fewer giraffes, a lot more elephants. I'm going to give you a second to do that. Okay. Well, let's go back. Okay, so you've looked that up and you saw that the giraffes are going to be near threatened now, or maybe even vulnerable. It kind of goes back and forth with them. But elephants are endangered. So we look at elephants, they have a higher status listing than giraffes. Why do you think that might be so? Well, if we look at giraffes, they're not a lot of poachers want to shoot a giraffe because they're not worth any money. Elephants, on the other hand, their ivory is still very valuable, and they're at a high risk of being killed due to poaching, and so that's why they're more endangered. Okay, if we look at the Venus flytrap, these cool carnivorous plants, they're endemic to a region in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina on the coast there. They live in swamps. And they're really rare because they're geographically limited. They only occur in a small region in North and South Carolina, and within that region they only occur in these swampy areas, so they're pretty rare. Okay, they're also currently becoming endangered due to people harvesting them. Even though we grow millions of Venus flytraps a year, businesses do, to sell, say like Lowe's and places, people are still doing wild collecting of them, and that's a bad idea. It's destroying the populations, and they're now endangered because of that. We can look at the Canadian ewe, and while it's really common in Canada, And up north, like Michigan, where it's cold, in Kentucky, it's super rare. It only exists in 2 sites, one of which being over in Carter County at Carter Caves, because it lives at the mouth of a cave that constantly pushes out cold air. And so in the summertime, it never gets hot. So it thinks it's up in Canada where it's never getting 100 degrees like here in Kentucky because it's getting air conditioned by the cave. Um, and so some species require really specific habitats like that, have specific requirements. There's a lot of those in Kentucky. Some species are rare just because they have small population sizes or are endangered or threatened, or these various things. Usually something's rare if it's endangered or threatened, but African elephants, there's a lot of them, and they're still endangered because of people. But the cheap mountain salamander, they have small population sizes, so they live up in the mountains in West Virginia, and there's never very many of them around, so they're red listed because of that. There's not very. Okay. So the intrinsic value of stuff just having the right to exist is what most conservation biologists believe in, but that argument doesn't really sell very much. Most people, they don't care. It's a salamander, so what? If it's the last of its kind, I want to put my house there or something, right? So let's look at some other values that people place on biodiversity. So the first are economic values, and we're going to go through different forms of economic values people place. So the first is food, right? If you're from Eastern Kentucky, you may hunt morels in the springtime. It's real common. Or if you're on the Atlantic coast, you might go crabbing and catch some blue crabs. You might go turkey hunting in the spring or go rabbit hunting in the fall. All these things are food, right? We eat them. And so many species are still wild harvested. So we collect them from the wild, like crabs and shrimp and stuff. If you eat turkeys, unless you go hunting and get them, then they were probably raised on a farm. But you're still eating them, and they're wild, so that's a value we place on species. Most of our domesticated species, think corn and beans and tomatoes and cows and all that stuff. Most domesticated species have wild relatives. In some cases, are pretty rare. And their wild relatives are sometimes not very common, but they provide useful genetic resources for future breeding. For instance, corn comes from this grain called teosinte down in the Central American highlands, and it's like pretty rare. It's not a very common grass, but scientists have found that it contains genes that are really useful in breeding modern corn, and so we use it for that some. So we like to eat corn. It came from the wilds originally. And more we're seeing new species being domesticated. The world population is climbing dramatically, and so we got to come up with new ideas, new ways to feed people, and new products. So like this is a picture of ostriches. People now farm ostrich for the meat and the eggs and the feathers. We still, though, in some parts of the world, people rely heavily on wild species for sustenance. And this has led to a decline in many of those species. In eastern Kentucky, a lot of people eat white-tailed deer. That's not really causing a decline in the population of those here, but in other parts of the world, say some of the indigenous tribes eat the flying fox, the big bats of the Philippines, and that's causing them to become endangered. Or if they're an African place eating a certain species of monkey, so sometimes these things are making them endangered. In North America, we can think of ducks. If you duck hunt, those are some examples of some things that we eat for food that have been over harvested. There's a species of duck called the canvasback that are originally, when people started duck hunting in the U.S. back in the day, they were the most abundant duck in North America. Now you see green-headed mallards as being the duck everywhere, but canvasbacks used to be the most abundant duck. They were also the biggest, and so people wanted to eat them the most because it's the biggest duck. And now they're one of the least common ducks in North America due to over harvesting. Okay, So we can also derive medicine from nature and from species. So we get money from that. For instance, ginseng. Ginseng is used as a stimulant in energy drinks, and because of this, a lot of people, they go sang digging and ginseng hunting, and this has led to the decimation of wild ginseng populations in the Appalachian Mountains. It's now people grow it commercially now, but there's a huge demand for ginseng as a medicinal root, so it's worth a lot of money. Also, white willow bark. Now we don't harvest it quite as much, but we used to, because it contains salicylic acid, and this is an ingredient in aspirin, the primary ingredient. It's the main thing in aspirin, and so we used to harvest willow trees, strip their bark off, and make aspirin out of them. Witch hazel, you can buy this at your big box stores or pharmacies. People use it for sunburns and stuff like that, or hemorrhoids. And witch hazel is a shrub that grows wild in eastern Kentucky, and they use it to distill this medicine. The Pacific yew. This is a tree that lives out in the Pacific Northwest, and within its bark it has a chemical called Taxol. And Taxol has been used to treat ovarian and breast cancer, both in women, very successfully. It used to be, breast cancer was kind of a death sentence, and it's still a horrible diagnosis. But thanks to this tree, the odds of surviving a diagnosis are much higher. But the thing about Taxol is we still can't make it in a lab. We can't synthetically produce this compound, so they strip the bark off of these trees and extract it from them. So that's how we get it. So it's a medicine. Leeches. So we still use leeches medicinally and medically. A long time ago, they were used a lot more. And people are like, oh, it's gross, I'm not going to use a leech. Well, the reason we still use leeches in modern medicine is because if you have an amputation of a body part, let's say you cut your finger off, cut your ear off, and you go to the doctor and they sew it back on. Your veins are kind of wimpy and flimsy. Your arteries are pretty tough. So I, as a surgeon, can sew your arteries back together and make them pretty much work. I can't sew your veins back together, so they've got to grow back together. Well, if you know anything about blood flow in you, the arteries push blood into your body parts away from your heart, and veins take the blood out of your body parts back to your heart. Well, if I'm pumping blood in, but it's not coming back out, you're just going to have crazy bad swelling, and then the part's going to die, and it's not going to take and reconnect. So what we can do is I can stick a leech on you, and the leech is going to absorb, suck out, drink all that extra blood until your veins can heal back together and return it to your heart on their own. So we still definitely use leeches in modern medicine. And we got possums, cute little guys hanging out. And so we study them a lot because possums are like superheroes. Like, you might look at them like, I hate possums, they're ugly or whatever, but possums are North America's only marsupial, meaning they got a pouch like a kangaroo, but they're like superpower. They can get bit by a rattlesnake and then chew its head off and eat it and not get hurt. Or they can have something with rabies bite them and they don't get it. They don't get rabies. They're immune to snake venom. So they got some pretty seriously cool stuff going on with them. So we study them, trying to figure out, like, how do they do that so they can make better medicines. Some more economic values. We can make clothes, houses, tools, fuel, wood. We use wood for a lot of that stuff, right? So wood's used to build paper. Your house is probably made out of wood. We decorate stuff with it. A lot of people around here burn wood in the wintertime to heat their house, so we use it for a lot of stuff. Silk is a really highly sought after fabric. It's really, really soft and really, really strong. Silk's pretty amazing, and like real silk is made from the silkworm moth. So it's a caterpillar that chews on a tree, and then when it spins its cocoon, they kill it and unspin its cocoon to get the silk. And so it's still, and has been for thousands of years in China, it's still a very important type of fabric because it's so strong, it's so light, and so soft. It's pretty awesome. We used to harvest whales, sperm whale in particular, to get their oil because they got a lot of fat. They live in really cold water, and so they got to have a lot of fat to insulate them. And we can see these containers here of sperm oil that came from sperm whale heads, and they were an important lubricant for a long time in a lot of machines and a lot of stuff in the early 1900s. It's now been replaced with jojoba oil, but for a while we used sperm oil. But you know, sperm whales kind of like to keep their heads, and it takes them a long time to get big. So we no longer harvest them to make oil. Sometimes, you just like to go hang out. Like, we got to have a reason to live, right? And so recreation's one of those. And so how do people in Kentucky benefit from its natural heritage? Well, we've got a lot of really beautiful places in the state. Okay. So Breaks Interstate Park, it's on the Kentucky-Virginia border. It's pretty awesome. People go whitewater rafting, smallmouth bass fishing, hiking, stuff there. Mammoth Cave National Park, it's the largest cave system in the world. It's pretty cool. It's here in Kentucky. We got Red River Gorge. Out in western Kentucky, we got cypress swamps. We got the Daniel Boone National Forest and the Ohio River. All of these, people can just go do stuff. You got a boat, kayak, you can just go hang out on the river. You want to go hiking, you want to go camping, you can just go out in the Daniel Boone. You want to go see beautiful underground passages, you go to the park, Mammoth Cave. So these things you can do just to have fun, to enjoy. And a lot of people do that. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry in Kentucky. Tourism is for people to come see our beautiful natural wonders. Okay, so we can also have species do stuff for us that would otherwise cost us a whole lot of money. And so we call these economic services or ecological services sometimes. So we have mussels. These guys are filter feeders, and they can clean water. So they can negate the need of water treatment plants in some places, but it's more usually for pollution, like runoff from farms and factories and parking lots and stuff. These guys can suck that out of the water so everything else can live. In Chesapeake Bay, if you're interested, you can read about it. The oyster beds in Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake River have helped tremendously in cleaning up the pollution there. It was basically uninhabitable by fish and everything, and now the oysters, which are a kind of mussel, have cleaned it up enough that other things can live. Box turtles, they do several things. One, they just look cool, but they also spread seeds around. So they're good seed dispersers. They look cool. Native Americans used to eat them and make stuff out of their shells. These things are maybe one of the most important things on the planet. And you're like, what the heck? It's just like a little bump. Well, legume root nodules. These things are amazing. They are little houses that the plant makes that house bacteria, usually some kind of rhizobium, but it's bacteria species that have this magic ability to take nitrogen from the air, break it apart, and turn it into nitrogen that the plants can use. And that might not sound like a whole lot because you just can go down to the local farm supply store and buy some fertilizer or Walmart, but it is amazing because they do it for free, just chilling out in the roots, in the dirt. For you or I to buy it, it's currently cheap because fossil fuels are currently cheap. But for humans to make nitrogen in the form plants can use, like fertilizer, we basically have to shoot lightning through the air to rip it apart. And lightning is hard to make. It takes a lot of energy. And it's called the Haber-Bosch method. And it's how most fertilizer is made. And it's very energy intensive. These guys do it for free. And without this, we wouldn't be able to grow stuff. Plants. And if plants don't grow, we don't grow. So they're pretty amazing. We have bats. A lot of people have stereotypes and stigmas against bats. But bats are really cool. It's like this cute little guy looking at you. He's like, oh, you might think he's scary and going to attack you and chew your face off. But that's not the case. Bats will never bite you. They're not going to drink your blood. Even vampire bats down in South America, they very, very rarely bite people. There's only one species that does that, and it ain't here. In North America, we have bats that are mostly insectivorous. They eat bugs, and in fact, they eat an awful lot of bugs. Um, there's a video link I posted on the Blackboard page you can look at of Doppler radar. So it looks like there's some moths, this big gypsy moth outbreak, and it looks like rain. There's so many of them. And you can see the bats come out of where they're sleeping during the daytime. There's so many bats that you see this other rain cloud coming on the Doppler radar, and then the moths disappear because the bats eat them all. It's pretty amazing. And mosquitoes, the bats around here eat an awful lot of mosquitoes, up to thousands a night. So bats are your friend because they, eat mosquitoes, which actually do cause a lot of diseases in humans. Then we got ladybugs. Ladybug beetles, lady beetles are really cool. They're pretty. We have native species that are nice and don't come in your house in the wintertime. And they're cool because they eat aphids. Aphids are a major agricultural pest. Ladybugs eat them for us. So we can save thousands of dollars on insecticide use and not have to kill all the other bugs if we have ladybugs eating the aphids. And there are companies you can buy ladybugs from and release them in your garden, and then they'll eat all the aphids and you don't have to spray it with anything. We have bees, in this case the honeybee. Honeybees provide massive amounts of pollination services for us. Many of our crops are pollinated exclusively by honeybees, and so without them, the grocery store would look a lot different. And then as a side benefit, they make honey for us. So bees do a lot of stuff for us too. So these are what we call services. They're all saving us money, basically. They're saving us money. Okay. So let's look at some different species and see what good we receive from them, right? What are the economic values of these species? Well, if we look at peat moss, you're like, that's moss. Who cares about sphagnum? It's just peat moss, right? Well, it is pretty cool in that it sequesters more carbon than any other genus of plants on Earth. So if we're talking about carbon credits, carbon taxation, peat moss sucks up more carbon out of the air than anything else on Earth. So that's A, pretty cool. And B, it makes peat. Peat is used for a heating source in lots of parts of the world. It's used as a soil amendment. Lots of horticultural stuff uses it. And my favorite is if you like Scotch. If you like Scotch whiskey from Scotland, then you owe all of that to peat moss because the grains that are used to make Scotch are smoked with peat. The water they use to make Scotch comes out of peat bogs. And so the signature flavor of Scotch is all because of that moss. So that's pretty cool. We look at white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer, they're overpopulated in Kentucky, but they provide a huge economic service, both in crop damage. They cost us a lot of money there. But if you ever try to go to your local Walmart store the day before deer season, it'll be crazy because they sell a lot of stuff, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm sure it's many, many millions of dollars a year are spent in the states that have white-tailed deer on just hunting related paraphernalia. Baker's yeast, this is how we make bread. Imagine a world without bread. It would be pretty expensive to try to do what the yeast does synthetically, and it would be rough. The same kind of yeast is what makes beer and wine and all the other things that have ethanol in them, like whiskey and all that. It starts out as something fermented with this yeast. So think about the world without alcohol. That would be a terrible place, and that would be the case without this yeast. So it's pretty cool that we have this thing to make all that for us. Yellow pine is a species, it's a tree that grows in the southeastern U.S. It grows pretty fast. And so we use it, like if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or someplace like that, you're going to see pine lumber a lot. So it's used a lot in building construction and houses and stuff. It's got a good strength to weight ratio. It grows fast, so it's a big industry there in construction. Ginkgo trees. Ginkgo trees are very often planted in cities. Ginkgos have a really cool story in history. They were thought to be extinct for about 300 years because they're only known from the fossil record from a couple 100 million years ago. And then a botanist discovered a couple trees in China. It's where they all of them come from a monastery in China that they'd been kept for like thousands of years. It's a pretty cool story about the ginkgo tree. But currently, we plant them in cities because they're very pollution tolerant. They can live in a sidewalk, and they make pretty shade. And they also have this cool trait of they drop all their leaves at the same time. So if you're paying somebody to rake leaves, you only got to pay them to rake leaves once. So ginkgo trees have a lot of neat traits there. Shiitake mushrooms. These mushrooms are delicious, and they're eaten all over the world. And they can fetch prices as much as $15 a pound. So they can be cultivated. They're grown commercially in lots of the world, including on farms in Kentucky. Okay. So that's getting us out of the money. The economic values, money talks, people care about money a lot. But there's other values we can place on nature. So kind of spiritual, right? And so do you ever been someplace where there's no cars, no traffic, no people, just hanging out in nature and gotten a good feeling, felt great, felt happy? Maybe you're chilling out on a rock by the creek. Maybe you like to trout fish and you're up in the mountains fly fishing. Maybe you're just fishing in a pond, or you're just walking in the woods. But you get some kind of spiritual, emotional zing about it, right? So that could be, right? You see a bald eagle. People seem to always get excited when they see a bald eagle. I'll see it on Facebook, or I'll hear people tell me, "Oh, I saw an eagle the other day at such and such a place," and I'm usually like, okay. But for some people, they really get into it because the eagle signifies, it's our national bird. It signifies freedom and all these values that we have in America. So it's pretty cool. The ichthus fish. Christianity has a fish as their symbol. Why do they have a fish? Because Jesus did the loaves and fishes thing? Maybe. But either way, people who are Christian often have a strong association with this funky little fish symbol. And they have a lot of spirituality tied up in that fish. Coca-Cola uses polar bears as their mascot. Not so much anymore, but for a decade or more, they had the polar bear in the Coke commercials. And that's because, you can't not like a polar bear, especially a cute, animated one like this. And so they use the polar bear as their mascot to elicit, spiritual, makes you feel good, emotional, happy feeling. Batman, the bat symbol, we use animal and nature symbology throughout our culture a lot. And a lot of it is to elicit emotional and spiritual responses, right? So bats, people think they're dark, they're ominous. Batman, he hides in the shadows and he lives in a cave and he's gonna come get you. So that's the bat symbol is doing that, right? Many species that we really have a strong emotional appeal to, say like a panda bear. I mean, who can look at a panda bear and not think it's cute? They're awesome, right? So you're looking at the panda bear and you're like, oh, they're cute. So these things will have, when we have this emotional thing, they can have existence value, right? So we really care about them. We're like, oh crap, pandas are going extinct. We should give $5 to help save the panda. And so people just want to help protect them to continue to exist because we like them. Another example is the harp seal. Harp seals are these furry, white-furred seals. Like there's one in the picture. And they once were almost extinct. They were endangered because that fur, well, they're swimming in Arctic waters. So it's pretty good fur. It's waterproof. It's really warm. If you want a warm hat, you can make one out of a harp seal and it'd be super warm. And so people hunted them for their furs for a long time. But finally, people are like, well, they're really cute. I don't need a fur hat that bad. I can use a polypropylene hat or whatever. And so they've been saved from the fur trade plight just because they're so cute. Sometimes there's just stuff we can learn from these species, right? So we have scientific values. Like birds, if nobody had ever seen a bird fly, we probably would have never thought to make an airplane, right? All the early airplanes and gliders and things were because we saw birds fly. So that's pretty sweet. They inspired us to fly. And that's still going on. We find animals that can do things, that can see different spectra than us and hear differently and stuff. And so we try to develop things. And we're like, wow, that's possible. Let's try to make it. Or, like spiders can walk on walls. And I'm like, well, how do they do that? Or geckos. Geckos are a great example. They can climb on glass. Like, it's insane, right? They're just walking up glass. And so people have studied that, and now we have like real life Spider-Man suits that people can walk up glass too, because we figured out how geckos do it, and we designed technology to allow people to do that too. Pretty slick. Another thing is echolocation of bats. People just studying bats because they thought bats were cool, and like, how can it fly in this dark cave and not bang its head on the wall? Figured out that it uses echolocation, which is where it makes noises. Those sounds go out, bounce off of an object, come back, it hears them, and it can navigate and determine what the object is, how far away it is, how big it is, and all that. And so because of studying echolocation, we were able to develop sonar technology. So this is how submarines work, boats, and even if you just have a fish finder, right? If you just like bass fishing and you got a fish finder, that's because we studied bats and learned how they do echolocation. Fruit flies, they kind of do that around my house when I got some ripe bananas. But fruit flies, they go all over the place, and they are kind of gross and kind of small, but they're amazingly important to us because they're the first animal that we fully sequenced the genome of. And so much of our understanding of how chromosomes work, how genetics work, is from studying fruit flies. And sometimes we can just have classroom materials that are derived from nature, like a goldfish tank, to talk about fish and to inspire people. There's that. So we can also have ecological values. Bald cypress trees and duckweed, they both dominate swampy regions of the southeast. And so if you're a duck, you might want to eat the duckweed, right? And so there's a lot of things that eat duckweed. A lot of stuff lives in the trees. Cottonmouths are hanging out in the swamp. Alligators are hanging out in the swamp. So these are creating a place for stuff to live. Grasses dominate prairies and savannas worldwide. Bison like to eat them. They create super fertile soils. This is why the Midwest, we grow so much corn and stuff there, soybeans, because it was once a prairie. And the Midwestern U.S. is prairie that we've plowed up, and it creates super fertile soil. And in many of these habitats and ecosystems, there will be a species that all the others are kind of connected to and rely on. It's called a keystone species. These keystone species are called that because without them, the ecosystem would fall apart. So examples are the flying foxes of Southeast Asia, the biggest bats in the world. Some of them have a 3-foot wingspan. Dung beetles, these roll up balls of poop, bury them, and lay an egg in them. And so they disperse seed. Many species, their seed dispersal relies on that bug burying that ball of poop. And so they're a keystone species, which seems crazy. They're so small in what they're doing, but they are. Beavers. Beavers are the only other species in the world besides us that can make a dam. So if you're a bluegill and you don't like living in the creek, you want to live in a pond, it's either going to be a person or a beaver that built the pond. Ducks, lots of other things, hang out in beaver ponds. So beavers are a keystone species. And the wolves. Wolves are a major keystone species. So this link here, I would like for you to go to it and watch it. It's a YouTube video about wolves, and it's made by a British guy. So they're referring to the elk as deer because in Europe They have elk, but they call them red stags or red deer, but it's the same thing. Um, but see how amazing the wolves have transformed Yellowstone National Park for the better. They've been a wonderful influence there. Some ranchers and stuff are like, oh, they're eating my sheep. You know, they might eat like one sheep a year. They're not a major damager of the sheep. What? Hang on. Let's go back. I'm totally off here. Okay, back to here. Okay, so how many other species are out there that we have yet to discover their value, right? Maybe the next cure for all cancer is some flower living in the rainforest, right? And so how would we feel if, you know, those millions of lives could have been saved, cancer could have been eradicated from planet Earth, but now we wanted a quick buck from logging, so we cut all the trees down. Now the flower's gone forever, it's extinct, and we're never going to know. So we should probably keep stuff around because it can do things we can't. Okay. Does everything have a right to exist? This is debatable, right? So polar bears, chimpanzees, kangaroos, these are pretty cool. They're big, they're pretty. Think about it. You think we should just shoot them all? Should we let them exist? Probably. Probably should. Most people would agree. These are what we call charismatic megafauna. They're big, they're cute, they're furry. We can relate with them most. People like them. How about this? Species with no self-awareness or nervous systems. Do they have a right to exist? Like a mushroom, a jellyfish? You know, chimpanzees are smart. They can talk to you. They can learn sign language. They can solve puzzles. Jellyfish and mushrooms, they can't. Do they have a right to exist? Well, if you use all those values that we've talked about, you could probably create an argument that, yeah, they probably should. What about these things? They're harmful. You know, you got coral snakes, which are venomous. We got ticks carrying disease, mosquitoes carrying disease, and bed bugs. You know, do these things have a right to exist? Can you justify the following? You know, the existence of those species using the values that we've talked about. You know, think about it to yourself. And you know, it's a judgment call, like, ultimately, right? And so, can we develop an argument for all species based on these values that we've come up with, including things that are harmful to us? Sums it up for biodiversity and how we value biodiversity and things we can use to argue for biodiversity. So for next time, you need to read chapters 4 and 5 in your textbook, and complete the chapter 3 quiz, which is about this chapter. And as you're reading chapters 4 and 5, there's kind of a lot of math, but you don't really need to understand how to do all the math. Just kind of, if you can't do the math, just skip over that. The other things are kind of more important.